of a place to dance. So over the last couple of days, we've done a series of sessions looking at where dance belongs, where dance can be placed, looking at its relationship to architecture, visual arts and audiences. And today's session is really looking at some of where we've placed some dance, but also who is involved in that in terms of non-dancing participants and some of the kind of thoughts around that. So Cathy on the end there, who is the Chief Exec of Creative Quarter. Provocation is being offered by Gillie Kleiman, who is Dance4's associate artist. So Gillie will lead her thoughts and share them, and then we'll go into a discussion which will open up to the panel, and then we'll take a short break and there'll be an opportunity to see a short film called A Dance at Home, which was part of a project Dance4 commissioned earlier this year, which Jane, who will introduce herself, and Paul and Cathy will also talk to you a little bit about before we see the film. So I'll pass you over to Gillie. Thank you.
Right. Hello. As Stuart said, I'm Gillie. I'm an artist. I make performances and sometimes other kinds of things. I'm also a very new doctoral researcher at the University of Roehampton, and some of what I'm going to say is born of my research as well as my artistic practice. Today we're talking about choreographic artworks in which the public takes some kind of non-audience role, a role usually otherwise filled by a professional arts worker, a choreographer or dancer or producer or something else. Issues arise in other setups. I propose that in these works, members of the public are workers. They're working. They're producing using their own creative forces, their energies, their time, their intellect and emotions and bodies, of course bodies, to make an artwork happen. My questions are about the nature of this work. Is it indeed work? How can we talk about it? What are the repercussions of thinking it as work or non-work? It's easy to see why such performances are vulnerable to accusations of exploitation. This is not always a question of payment. Many artists in other works aren't paid, as we know. And sometimes in these performances, the participants are. But here, a performer, a kind of creative collaborator, is seen as engaging in leisure. Their labour is undermined as a hobby, as recreation, as a way of receiving rather than generating value. One person's leisure, then, is repackaged through the creation and presentation of a performance as another person's labour, a work of art. These practices sit in a particular way in relation to the English dance ecology. They can be seen to be located in the overlap between two parts of British dance with distinct languages, traditions, aesthetics and practices, so-called professional dance and community dance. These two forms, though always related and often intertwining in other ways, are mostly supported or created by different practitioners, organisations. So I will say that every organisation I've ever had anything to do with expresses regret at this sort of divide. As a result, these works express complexes of agendas and attitudes in multiple dance traditions in sophisticated ways, particularly through the doubling of this beneficiary group, so who benefits from the work. One set of beneficiaries are the performers, who receive the artistic practice through participating in the production and presentation of the work, unlike most professional dance productions. The other group is the audience, receiving the artistic practice through spectatorship, less usual in community dance. As such, the works operate in a privileged position with regard to government arts policy as handed down to arts producers of all kinds, including artists, through funding policy. They are value for money for artists, organisations, funders and audiences. I am suspicious of that which seems a good idea because it's value for money. A third way in which these works can be problematic is that sometimes they're just not very good. Like any other category of artistic practice, it's true. Like any other category of artistic practice, there are examples that are marvellous, dynamic, challenging works of art, and others that use the structure of participation to produce thoughtless, dull spectacles that serve as nothing much more than an experience big in numbers and small in nuance. Perhaps then the problem is not so much with the works, but in their categorisation, their collection together according to these particular systems of production. The discourse begs for refinement. So I've talked it down. It's clear, of course, yeah, start there, that this is a of the negative political repercussions of these practices. An alternative view might be equally emphatically expressed, and here are some of its strands. The backdrop for the production of this work is late capitalist Britain. There's much talk in academic and popular domains about the fact that there aren't enough labour hours in the economy for all working age people. Increasingly, the expansion of immaterial and affective labour, as well as certain technological developments, means that work can consume all corners of the day and week. The question, what do you do, is ubiquitous, and almost always means, what do you do for work? How do you make money? These works propose something totally different. They suggest that what do you do could be answered by describing what the responder contributes to the world in their free time, as part of their leisure life. These works then encourage, cultivate and celebrate the capacity humans have to contribute to the world outside working life. This practice, with its overlapping or periodically shifting categories of labouring and leisuring, has the potential to radically destabilise binaries associated with types of human activity, disconnecting obligation, financial reward and social status, for example, from work, and pleasure, ease and private living from recreation. My interest is in investigating this performance making and its resultant productions in order to consider how they contribute to a remapping of long established understandings of work and its related notions, offering potent alternative perspectives and performed resistance to dominant modes of living and working within and beyond dance and performance. These works contribute to recalibrations of categorisations of the professional and its opposite, whether you figure that as amateur, untrained, non-professional and so on. This can only happen because of dance's particularities, with its assumed capacities and extra special virtuosities. Let's not forget that dancing, as opposed to dance as art, is already a source of meaning-making in many domains of human experience, like clubbing, shaping and reshaping bodies, events and social relations. Moreover, the practice at the centre of our discussion has a lengthy lineage in other domains, like exercise and ritual, and in other superficially more clear-cut histories of non-professional performance, like amdram or folk dance. These works use the best of what dance can do to question something bigger than itself. Within dance itself, within the field, the fact that these works straddle professional dance and community dance means that they actively provide an important challenge to normative understandings of proper value measurement, funding, production and cultural policy. My confusion on a recent funding application about whether to count the participant performers as artists or as beneficiaries expresses the edges of these categories, reminding me that it isn't really necessary that one person always be a suffering, exploited worker in order for someone else to have a meaningful or valuable experience. In this brief talk, I hope I've unfolded what seemed to me to be some of the key issues around this kind of work, the work that we've turned up to pay attention to and think about. I've also, I think, exposed some of my biases and presuppositions. Importantly, I want to emphasise the fact that the very things that make these works highly problematic are also those that make them potent. I'm not interested in an ethical sanitisation that might make what we do more politically correct, for that would only serve to eradicate the radicalities we're activating. An agenda for me has been to note the sparseness and shallowness of existing discourse on these works, and to think about how we can together make it as complex, sharp and exciting as some of the field's best examples. Before I close, I'd really like to say thank you to Dance4 for making the space to think about things that I think are really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillie. The purpose of a provocation is to provoke thought and provoke debate, and I think that has done that beautifully for this group of people gathered here in this room. We're going to just introduce the panel to you, and they're going to say a little tiny bit about dances and dances as artworks in which they've been a participant, and then we'll open the discussion with the panel. Paul, do you want to kick off and introduce yourself?
I will. So I'm Paul Russ. I'm the artistic director at Dance4. Thank you, Gillie. I think what feels important to me we've entered into many conversations with artists and the public about the creation of work over the last few years, and seen some wonderful works appear and be shared with the broader public. And however, I'm constantly questioning how they're perceived, what we're asking of people to do beyond, in their leisure time, and concerned, I suppose, that there's a place for a conversation to happen around understanding more deeply what practice is being developed by Dance4 and the people that we're connected to. The starting point for quite a lot of those conversations with artists and the public, however, were maybe trying to spot that as an organisation that's been long associated with championing work, and so dance and choreography at the margins of what people perceive dance and choreography to be, it felt important in some way to open up a dialogue about the work that artists were exploring and a discourse they have with their practices and others. And somehow that was maybe going to illuminate for us ways to open up a broader conversation with the public about more conceptually driven practice. And so that was our starting point, and that's where we've been in some way trying to explore.
I think it was interesting the way you articulated it as a kind of an area where the binaries break down, as a grey area where you're not sure what's work and what's non-work, where the professional is and the amateur or the non-professional is. I think that grey area is why we're here today, because we've all engaged with that grey area and discovered new things about what it means. Jane, tell us a little bit about your involvement in this kind of work.
Yes, so I'm Jane. Hello. So I'm a freelancer, which means I do lots of different things. I was formerly a dancer, and during my work as a dancer, we did lots of community projects in the 90s where it was really about getting people to dance and sort of learning on the ground about this other side of the work that I needed to engage in, which was how to work with dance to make connections with people. As I've continued making my own work and then working in theatre collaborations, in devising situations, in kind of participatory projects, I feel more and more strongly that I really don't make a distinction between working working with professional co-collaborators or working with in a kind of community context, or working in the way that I've recently been working with Dance4, which I think is why I'm here today, making performance in people's homes. And so I'm really, really interested in the questions. I get a bit stuck in the articulation around it. I'm more comfortable sort of doing, really, which for me a bit is how can I build a relationship in a context? What is that context that I'm working in? How can I build a relationship where a process, it's not always like this, but a process and performance are inseparable. They work together, and I feel often that I need both. And the participants I'm working with will benefit from an experience of both.
I mean, you raised the question of language as well, Gillie, didn't you? And you used some key words there, Jane, that have in the past been used to describe this practice, participatory, community art, devising, or whatever. And I think it's finding a new kind of language to describe some of the work, isn't it? Joe, tell us a bit about.
So, hi everyone, my name is Joe Moran, and I'm a choreographer based in London. I'm also an associate artist with Dance4, and I direct an organisation called Dance Art Foundation. So, similarly to Jane, I work with lots of different groups. So I work with professional dancers, but also people from kind of all walks of life, really. And through Dance Art Foundation, I run a national dance and health programme called Breathing Space. And that's mainly participatory. I also work with lots of business people. who themselves come, in a way, are all from different walks of life. And I think partly my invitation to be here is that last autumn I worked with Dance4 to create a project working with local performers. In a way, kind of a real mix, kind of maybe quite indeterminate about whether they would, as Gillie is saying, identify as professional artists or kind of in that in-between place. And I'm just reflecting that really part of my interest as a choreographer is thinking about who we are, you know, and how we are and how we might be. And for me, that kind of, in a way, demands that the different works that I make maybe include very different types of performers. So I think that piece, the piece that we made, we presented it at Nottingham Contemporary called The Body, and it's 9 performers and 10 chairs. And yeah, I really wanted to have a sense of just a real full range of people.
And who was tell us a bit more about the range of people who were involved.
This is when I need Heather.
You can have Heather.
We had people, we had one 16-year-old, so age range kind of 16 to 60s, I guess, maybe a little older, men and women. And what was really nice in a way that the kind of process of working together wasn't really contingent on our experience or skills as performers. Yeah, so a real mix.
Interesting. I think we'll come back to it, but you raised the question of the society and the structure of the society, Gillie, and I suppose one of the things that there are some great universalities potentially, you know, who we are, how we live in the world, you know, a process that we can, relationships, but there are also things that are very specific to the kind of period we live in, you know, the kind of late capitalist Britain as well. And I think, you know, it's interesting to look at how they influence or affect the process and how they are negotiated through the process. We'll come back to that with the audience as well. We want to hear from Greg. Tell us about your involvement in 2 projects, Greg.
Hello, I'm Greg. I'm the non-dance member of the panel. I have been involved in 2 projects in the last 3 years. I worked on Assembly with Nicola Conybeare, and this year I worked with Florence Peake on Lay Me Down. And that is my sole dance experience outside of dancing at weddings.
Which, as Gillie reminded us, is all part of the meaning-making process that we go through. Dancing at weddings is just as important as clubbing, etc., the folk dance, yeah. So why did you get involved? Tell us a little bit about the why.
I'll tell you about the how.
The how.
Well, Jennifer, my daughter, she works with Dance4, and she was aware of the Nicola Conybeare project coming up. And Nicola was looking for people, not necessarily dancers, and from different age groups, and Jennifer just suggested that I might be interested in doing it. And initially, my initial reaction to something like that is, oh no, not me, I can't perform. And then when she described it a bit, I just thought, well, why not? I'm open to new experiences, do new things. So I signed up for it with the proviso I could back out at any time I wanted.
So there was an opt-out clause, was there?
If Stuart let me. But no, I got involved and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
And would you, following on from Gillie's provocation, would you describe yourself as a participant, a beneficiary, a dancer in the process?
I was certainly a beneficiary because I started it as a challenge to myself. You know, can I do this? And I think through the process that both Nicola and Florence took us through of becoming comfortable with your bodies and with interacting with other people, I got a lot of benefit from that, and I got relaxed into what we were doing, and I got enjoyment out of it. So yes, I did benefit. In terms of being performer, I was certainly there were two pieces in which you were very much told what you were going to do. There were strict parameters around what you did. So there wasn't a lot of room for self-expression. Some people tried. I noticed that the dancers in the piece, they do try to express themselves a bit more.
A bit beyond what the choreographer tells them, is that?
If there's a little chink, if there's a little gap there that can exploit, they exploit it.
So you were exploiting the choreographer rather than the choreographer exploiting you.
I wasn't doing any exploiting. But I did have a feeling, certainly in the second project, where it wasn't quite so strictly defined, what you were to do. So I actually felt that I could be creative within that environment, which was interesting for me, because I don't consider myself to be a creative person at all. So I'd certainly got a benefit from that.
So has your perception of yourself shifted? Do you now consider yourself a creative person?
Partly. I think it's the answer. Partly. I could see myself doing some more projects. You didn't hear that, Stuart.
That's another opt-out clause, isn't it?
Do mine.
Because Gillie raised all kinds of questions about value and who determines value, and questions about quality. What's good, what's not good, and I suppose also questions about investment, and what do people get back for the investment of time and energy, and that goes as much for the choreographer as it does for the participant, in inverted commas. And I suppose questions about if you're getting paid or not getting paid, how that affects your response and your experience through the process. What do people how do people respond to some of those questions that Gillie proposed?
Well, to me, it didn't make any difference as to whether I got paid or not. I'm not in a position where I need to get paid for it. For me, it was about commitment, and I think the payment aspect raises questions about if you're proposing to pay public participants, would you get a level of commitment that you would get with dancers who would do it for nothing, or non-dancers who would also do it for nothing but willing to give their time and energy to make the piece successful? And I think these are the grey areas that you're thinking about. And
it feels to me as well that the notion of what the invitation is and the instigation of a conversation between the artist and whoever they're collaborating with, I suppose, feels that from time to time I feel that that's what we've been grappling with. What is the invitation and what is clear and what is not clear in that initiation of a conversation about entering into a process. And that seems to shift depending on who the artist is that's instigating the idea, what the parameter will actually may well end up being the outcome, what will end up being the work. Often, sometimes also begins to shift the way in which, it shifts the invitation, of course, but also alters the view of whether whether the experience should be monetized in some way for the individual taking part.
I interviewed Rosemary Lee about 2 years ago now. Rosemary Lee has a long history of making very large-scale works with non-professional and professional participants in different ways. And I really pressed her on this issue of money, which she didn't like very much, but it's all right. And you can read most of the interview on Belly Flop magazine if you're interested. And she said that the one project in which there had been a stipend for participant performers, the nature of the project had been quite different, and it had changed the relationships, the sort of her capacity to facilitate, because she talks about her practice as a facilitative one. And I guess I think the kind of the political correctness that I was talking about would say we must pay everybody. We must always pay everybody for their time because otherwise they're exploited. Well, one sort of case is that we're all exploited under capitalism. That's how capitalism works. The point of capitalism is that we are exploited. Our work, we're always producing more value than that for which we're paid. That's how capitalism functions. So when you sort of think about that, you go, well, a little bit more exploitation. And then the other point is that I would like to think, and I would like to find out more about this, but I'd like to think that there's a certain different quality that appears in the work, in the actual performances, and is somehow sensible in the sense of, tangible somehow in the work, that comes of the fact that people are not paid, and it is quite clear that they're doing this of their own free time, that it's non-work activity that has a different texture or sensibility or something like that.
There's something about that phrase, the labour of love, though, isn't there? Because labour has become associated with capitalism, but actually there's a different kind of labour where you're working incredibly hard, but actually you're deriving immense satisfaction from it. And I think both Jane and Joe, you talked about seeing yourselves as facilitators or enablers of a kind of process. And Jane, you've always talked about commitment to that process. And I suppose what's really interesting about the work I did with Jane, I've never worked with you, Joe, so I can't speak for any kind of working relationship we would have, was that you find that you are kind of co-producers of the meaning in the work. And the work can't exist without both of you being totally committed to it. And sometimes that commitment takes the form of, we'll do 5 hours extra because we're chasing something and trying to find something, which Jane and I did one day, where you give extra time voluntarily without even thinking about the cost or the whatever, because you are so caught up in the exploration and the discovery and the making of the work together that actually everything else becomes immaterial, and you're creating a different kind of value than that of capitalism. It's a kind of emotional relationship value, it's a psychological value, and actually it's value in the art form as well, because you're discovering a new kind of art form together. So I suppose I'm interested in your kind of role as facilitators and negotiators of in a relationship with other people in a process. How do you go about that, Jane, I suppose?
I don't know perhaps how to answer it directly, but the things I'm thinking about are that it's quite difficult to actually get a group together. So the whole thing about actually identifying a group or making an invitation really clear, or this is a little aside, but I really wanted to do something with rugby, and I've been wanting to do it for absolutely ages, and I didn't have an organisation to do it through, and I'd applied through various I'd really constructed this idea, and in the end I was like, well, I'm just going to do it myself. So I went through the local rugby club, and I was like, and I got a phone number from the chair of something, and I phoned him up, and I had to say quickly, I would really like to work with your young people to do this thing. There's the Rugby World Cup coming up, but not. It was very difficult to put into words an offer on the phone, which I knew would sound really woolly, and who was I? Anyway, I went up to the rugby. He met me, and I went up to the rugby pitch, and I had these ideas. And I'd been cooking them for a long time. He said, leave it with me. I'm curious, and it was about rugby, it was about boys with their dads. And his son was in the room. He said, I'll speak to my son about it. And he spoke to his son about it, and he said, I'll get back to you and I'll ask all the boys. And he had about 40, and not one was interested. Not one. It was a bit upsetting, actually. and I so I was like, I wish I'd gone myself, but he didn't want me to. And this is just one example of having an idea, trying to reach people, and the complications of that. So recruitment, for want of a better word, the design of a project is a whole other thing. So how much, if you're talking about the relationships, how much time can you ask for? So I would be filtering all that, going, well, rightly or wrongly, going, well, and each process would have a different kind of internal monologue going, but so as I said before, there's performance and there's process and performance. Got a deadline. Realistically, how many hours? Either how many hours have I got, or how many hours do I need? Is that 5 minimum? Is that 3 minimum? Is that 10? What is that? What does that look like? How can I realistically and sensitively and respectfully negotiate a time where a commitment can be made, more with some foundations that feel that feel good, even if then later on, because that relationship's working, you can do 5 more hours. You can't on day one. That's possibly not fair.
And I suppose what you're talking, Paul talked about the invitation. You're talking about the negotiation.
Well, sort of the design of a program.
The design of the program, and actually how you design a process. What's your experience of that, Joe? What do you think are the key things to think through
in designing a process? Well, I agree. I kind of concur that I think the invitation and the frame is really important, and I probably err a bit on the political correct side. So when we did the project last autumn, I think I feel like this with all the people I work with. I want to be incredibly clear what the request is and what the invitation is, and what the time will be and what the fee will be. So for our project, we did pay performers, and we didn't really think of it as a participatory process. We thought about it as working, we said, with local performers, but that was really open to who wanted to get involved. But I'm just kind of reflecting for myself as well that I've performed in Lay Me Down, which I think has it's called something else now. It's changed its name. Florence's piece, Laid Down, I think. I did it in Oxford, and I as an artist, am kind of on that fight that everyone gets paid and gets paid properly, and our time is valued, and have also yet really enjoyed doing performance projects where perhaps it's not paid, or paid, less than what I would normally be paid, and so for me as a performer, I think I also can edge into that grey area of maybe being a participant, of feeling like I'm there because I really love it and I'm really getting something from it, and I can relate to your experience, Greg, of working with Florence. But I'm also kind of thinking of the Musée de la Danse, the Boris Sharmat's project at Tate Modern, and part of that project, I haven't heard it described in this way, but there was one performance by volunteers. So they weren't called performers or participants. They were there as volunteers. So that kind of exchange was really clear. I think the frame that they weren't being paid was very apparent, and it was so. It's such a great piece that they did anyway. But it was so thrilling to feel that kind of labour of love. It was, and that kind of sense that you're talking about, that in the work there's a quality of, we're here because we really, really love it, and it's really exciting. But I haven't answered at all what you asked me.
But I think it's you mentioned a couple of really key things, though. I think sometimes it's about the clarity. It's kind of knowing which you are, so you know which part of the grey area you're occupying, and also that frees you. If the clarity is there, that frees you to move from being in one mode or the other, or the multiple different modes. If somebody came along and made you an offer, Joe or Greg, to participate in a piece, and this time you might get paid, you would go into it with potentially a different perspective. But fundamentally, it's not, I think it's probably about more than money. You mentioned that it's about the exchange. And and the frame.
And we've got to be so careful about that. I think we know that, because that's been the discourse for the artist for so long. You get to do something you love. Shouldn't really blah blah blah, which we know, and it's boring.
And it's about the sensitivity and the respect, and also being aware that there will be moments where that can break down, And I remember having a kind of an afternoon with Jane when I was going on, I was getting really frustrated, and I was going, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know. And part of me was thinking, oh my God, I'm not getting paid for this. What the fuck am I doing here? Do you know what I mean? So even your own sense of yourself shifts in that relationship and in that exchange, and what you get out of it. You know, you only discover what you get out of it as you go along as well. So you enter the process like you did, Greg, without really knowing how you were going to feel about it at the end, because you kind of jumped in. And I think there is something about the frame and the parameters that is very determined by the organisation and by the choreographers as well. You know, is it a strict frame where the structure is laid down, in the case of the Rosemary Lee piece, for example, or is it, you know, is it a flash mob where you literally have to follow the steps in the music and be, you know, part of a great group of people, or is it something much more flexible where you're much more a contributor to the world, and where you're, you know, contributing your stories, your content, your ideas, your music, your house. Yeah. So how does the frame kind of vary in terms of those parameters, and how does the exchange change when there's that kind of, when there's more space for the participant to be a co-creator in the work? That's kind of to everybody, but partly to you, Greg.
I think the issue of paying people is, it's a fraught one. I think, as I said earlier, for me there was never an issue because it's about commitment. I think there's a danger that when you're paying, if you send out an invitation, you make it known that that you will be paying people, you're going to get a certain response from people who are maybe not interested in the piece, who are just foot soldiers who turn up and will participate, but maybe not give their commitment, and maybe not end up. You might end up with something that looks different from what you saw in the beginning, because you've got people who've not bought into the process. Now, at least there's lots of practicalities around that. I mean, how you plan it, you don't know what you've got to work with. How can you lay parameters if you don't know who the people are and what commitment you're getting? And if you're paying people, you're entering into an employer-employee relationship with all of the problems that brings. I mean, how do you maintain people's commitment? Do you pay them for every session they turn up? And risk them maybe not turn up for the performance because some of them have cold feet and they've not bought into it? Are you paying people based on their experience, their what they're given, skill level, or what they're given to the process, or are you just paying them by the hour for turning up? I think money brings in so many, just many difficult questions, as indeed you said.
But I think there are questions there that are true of all performance making processes outside of this situation, because there isn't enough money to make all the artwork that everyone wants to make. Many people do projects for which they're not paid. There are different sort of dynamics of that in different places in the country, in my experience. In Newcastle, where I'm from, people tend to do, I mean, there's a totally different set of like agreements about what is appropriate, what is ethical, what is usual. If they're my friend, do I do that for them for free because I know that they're going to come in on my terms? I mean, it is really human, this thing. It's messy. Yes. It's really messy. And it's true that these sort of administrative procedures determine what the work is at the end. But I don't necessarily think that always paying someone always means that it becomes a sort of contractual situation, because in fact there are many situations in which people aren't paid. And I mean, there are hundreds of tiny dance companies in London, for example, where it's like the choreographer is the master, and they come in and you do class and you engage in this work and you do exactly the movements that the choreographer tells them to do. And I think we're sort of in a sort of luxurious position because we're here as a Dance4 event, so we have a certain set of agreements about what kind of work we're talking about. But that's not true of every situation. So these kind of dynamics, the relationship between choreographer and collaborators, between choreographer and organisation, choreographer and audience are different in each situation. And I do think that we have a habit of gathering the things together and going, this is how it is, and we should do it like that. When in fact, each time all these like tiny decisions about whether to work for 2 hours to begin with, and to work for 2 hours over 12 weeks, 2 hours every week for 12 weeks, or to do an intensive weekend, that changes what the work is going to be. but it changes people's relationship to one another. It changes people's relationship to their working life. Like I go to work, then I go to my dance rehearsal, or I take 2 days off work and I go. Those things,
and it changes the process by which commitment is built, because commitment isn't always completely there at the beginning. You know, commitment is negotiated and it develops. What Paul?
So, I'm interested, I suppose, in maybe, particularly the three of you, maybe sharing something about what it is at the genesis of an idea, which means that you then seek bodies that aren't the professional body or the trained body, or whether that's even at that beginning. What is it that's at the heart of that? So the body, very different proposition to singular in terms of what do you expect of those involved.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. I think it does very much relate to what Gillie's saying, that in a way, and picks up your question that I didn't answer about process, but in a way whether someone is paid or not is clearly very significant. It's part of that process, but it's one part, and actually the ethos and the philosophy of the way of working, which incorporates that, is perhaps possibly more determinant about what that process will be and what the agreements are and what the piece will then become. And as you're suggesting, perhaps there's some implication that we have a shared ethos, you know, being here, we're working with Dance4. But for me, I think always every piece is different, which doesn't help in many ways. But I tend to, when I'm making work, still think about the kind of artists and collaborators who I've developed relationships with, and they tend to be trained professional dancers who are kind of highly experienced. And I often say I just want to work with dancers who can do everything. You know, just someone who's brilliant in every way.
The superhuman.
The superhuman. Well, yeah, just the super person.
The super person.
Maybe. And. But I think what's at the kind of the heart of my practice, I was saying earlier, is an interest in collaborators as people, and I guess that shifts and widens in different ways. And I think I would be interested to work more broadly, and in a way, perhaps the body is a kind of step toward that. But the piece that we're talking about, the body, when I first created it, when I presented it in London, it was with in a way a kind of community of people. It's with independent dance artists who had an extraordinary body of knowledge and experience, and some of them were in a way much older, and some of them don't maybe conform to this idea of the kind of the dancer body, if you like. So that piece was open in that way, maybe. I think I'm not concerned with the dancer's body as such, more, you know, what the maybe dancer is, their skill or their experience or what they're practicing. I'm kind of talking myself into a dead end here.
Is there something for you, Jane? You know, what's the impulse for you around working with people who aren't trained dancers, who can carry the stories of their lives in the body?
Well, there's a sort of an overarching question about why am I sat here sort of advocating that I want to be involved in, or I feel sensitised to working where movement and choreography and maybe sometimes personal stories are interwoven within those ways of working, which are then shared with people. So I'm sat here getting all a bit palpity in my chest because of your stillness, Gillie's stillness in there. So I switch my eyes in a way So you asked a question, where's the idea? And I go, well, the idea will switch if I switch. Sorry, I didn't say that very clearly. And I'm just sort of looking, and then I go, so it's difficult to put it into words. So the context is really important, because the context determines
So much. Yeah.
You know, why you're there, why whoever you are with is with you. And so sometimes I say, I want to work with anyone who wants to work with me. And to answer your question about why I'm drawn to perhaps a range of people, is because I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the smallness of the movements. That doesn't mean that the work has to all be microscopic, but I'm interested in those things. I'm interested in a perception of the body alive in the moment, and then the sculpting of that, the working with that. So I don't know, we move all the chairs and we leave Gillie in the middle, and then we just turn the lights down, and then something's happening. I get really excited. I'm not going to do that. I get really excited. Now, it's not because I have this idea about a woman in the spotlight. It's about, and that's why it's scary sometimes. That's why it's a bit like, well, it may seem like I don't know what I'm doing, or do you feel the same? Yeah. Well. So really, anybody is interesting.
Yeah. Okay.
If they want to be there, and then it's full of contradictions, because even if they don't want to be there, that's still interesting. And then it's all about those other things about making that okay, and what are we doing together, and how do I take care of you, and how is that a reciprocal process, and is there an outcome, which means that some of that learning can be looped back in and actually can be understood. So it's not just confusing or exposing, or and that word exploiting, I get, which comes up if perhaps there's a sense that someone may not know what they're getting into. Maybe that's where it comes up, and I try. It doesn't mean I'm successful, but I try to say a few things. Be vulnerable myself, not be in a place of
expertise.
Is it okay? So something, negotiating permissions around stuff, establishing a kind of trust where you can try something, accepting that, I suppose around, I'm going off on one here, sorry, the thing of work makes me, and sort of participation, I think about words like, people say, oh, is it going to be fun, is it going to be enjoyable, and I get uncomfortable because maybe not. Most likely not fun.
But you can't put that on the flyer.
I don't know. And then you go, is that true? No, it's not true. You still have a nice time. Of course you have a nice time. But it's not about, it's not without an absence of, it's not with an absence of risk. It can't be. Can't possibly be. Otherwise there's other ways to relate or connect, but it's not the body's not the foregrounded part. Then if the body is foregrounded and you're doing something that you wouldn't normally do, it cannot be without risk. And so if risk is there, and somebody who also wants to be there is there, and there is a negotiation, which is what means you're working, then I will work with anyone, and I mean that. Give us a job.
That idea of anybody, actually, that this can apply to anybody is a really, really powerful idea, because it comes back to that concept, which some people agree with or don't, is that Joseph Beuys, everybody is an artist. Actually, everybody is born a dancer, and if you don't feel you're a dancer now, it's kind of kicked out of you in school or at some point in your life. So I suppose I'm interested in the audience. It'd be good to bring the audience into the discussion and see what your responses are to some of those questions, and bearing in mind, I think that what a lot of people have talked about are all the different decisions that are made in the moment, from minute to minute within the process, and every decision is an ethical decision. It has some implication for what the output's going to be, or what the outcome's going to be, and how people feel about the process as well. Is there anybody in the audience who's been through a similar experience, a similar type of process? No one.
You're in the right
Mark,
place.
that's not true.
In the 1970s, yes.
What was the experience like in the 1970s then?
There was a call out for people who are not dancers to go and do class or have performance. And I went along and I was that guy. I must have spent several hours sort of prancing around in the space. And then I was just hugely disappointed because I wasn't included.
Oh, so it was kind of audition process.
Yeah. But I don't think I realised, fully realised what was happening. I think perhaps I was looking for a range of body types, and perhaps he got rather too many of my body types.
I mean, I think that for me that raises an important issue of this sort of range, this tokenism that can happen of like, I need someone who's non-white, because this is what makes it normal people. Someone non-white, someone overweight, someone old, someone young, someone whatever. And I think there is, in our sort of parlance, there is like, oh, we're opening it up. I just want a range of people. And what does that actually? I mean, what does that actually mean? Does that mean that I will exclude two people because they're white women aged 40? I mean, what is that kind of tokenism that is very tempting to engage in?
But equally, there is that other side of that is wanting to have, or wanting the piece to represent the diversity of humanity. Wanting it because art fundamentally is about representing the huge, enormous breadth and diversity of people and humanity and experience.
I don't think so, for example.
Do you not?
No, I don't. I don't think any artwork can represent humanity.
Do you?
Not in any way. And I think it's really dangerous, actually, to think that any artwork's job is to represent human spirit, universality, and I think artworks do all kinds of things.
Yeah, but I'm not necessarily saying that it is about representing universality. I think it represents a particular view or a lens on a particular version of humanity or a particular group of human beings in a space and time in a unique context. That's not quite the same as saying it's universal, I think. But the choice of those people and those individuals, within that room determines, ultimately, is one of the key decisions that a choreographer makes, isn't it?
But I don't think this is like, I don't think an artwork needs to be like quoted. So if the audience is going to be...
Oh no, I totally agree with you.
So then we must represent all these different groups. I mean, an artwork can be a special, specific thing of its own that represents only itself or whatever.
But there is something, for example, in Jane's idea, I want to work somehow with rugby players. That's a particular segment of humanity that somehow interests Jane. But we don't want to get kind of too caught up on that. But I think your experience is, we can follow that up afterwards, Gillie. Your experience, though, is interesting. Do you think that the practice has shifted from the 70s to now? Do you think that it is a more sophisticated practice, a more sophisticated discourse? When you were talking about risk. Yes, go on.
I was going to say...
Sorry, Stuart.
No, I was just going to say it's really interesting because we talk about, wanting to work with a range of people, and I was involved when Greg first was part of Assembly, and actually you all had to write a letter of interest or kind of share your experiences, and we framed that day as come and have a taster session, and people came in the room, but ultimately we learned a lot from that because the choreographer was making some decisions and not everyone in that room was chosen. That was about numbers of people because we only needed 25 people, but ultimately we placed people in a situation where people came for a taster and they wanted to be part of the project, but everyone couldn't be. So you are making those decisions, and you are asking people. Similarly with Joe's The Body, people had to send an expression of interest. So it's quite interesting that we still go through that selection process, even of non-dancers or non-professionals. And for someone like Greg to have to write that about themselves.
Yeah, and you're.
I was going to pick up on how things changed in the 70s and what Stuart's just said. But what I was going to respond, how things changed from the 70s, and what I was thinking of this long between Gillie and you was Paul's how he framed an invitation.
Yeah.
And James, I work with anyone who wants to work with me, and Greg's commitment. And this is looking much more towards the people. And if we take the 70s example, it's looking towards a kind of tokenism, what the choreographer wants.
Yeah.
And the invitation is maybe looking more towards relationships and what's possible rather than what I want already moving. When Stuart picks up the taster day, it seems to me that those people who came to the taster day also chose if they still wanted it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
people can
Yeah.
say no back to the choreographer.
There's a double choice. There's a choice.
So, I don't really know what's going on in the 70s, but that seems to be something that's in this conversation, something more complex about something about aesthetic that can arise. And again, that brings me back to something that Greg said, which was, you joked about the dancer's self-expression. And I can't quite catch this train of thought now, but there is something here about it not, by working with bodies that are not dancer-trained bodies, maybe there's already a desire towards a kind of aesthetic that's not about self-expression. Well, let's not limit dancers to self-expressing.
Yeah.
But the risk of the highly trained body desiring to express is present.
I mean, perhaps something that has shifted in the question of whether something that's shifted is, I think, so-called professional dance has shifted a lot. And this question of what a dancer's body is probably the most irritating question that we continue to circulate amongst one another, because I don't have, I'm not a dancer's body, but I'm a dancer, and that produces for me a lot of anxiety when people say to me, oh, so what do you do? I'm a dancer, and they look at me and they're like, what, really? Oh, I used to be morbidly obese. I'm not anymore, but it was worse then. And I think now in dance, in professional dance, I hope in our corner of dance, there's a slightly more refined and nuanced set of understandings about the fact that we can all dance. Skill isn't a set of criteria we already know before we begin. Virtuosity doesn't always mean the same thing. Dancing isn't always about athleticism. Unfortunately, lots of areas of dance do continue that. When I see, training is, for the dance athletes of the future, I just think, it's so stupid. Come on. So I think in that sense, it's not so much that the works that we're talking about have shifted, but that so-called professional dance might have moved along a little bit, so that perhaps the divide isn't so clear in that sense, and that's quite exciting. I think it's really great.
And I think that's what I was trying to articulate at the beginning about an area of interest where it feels still that there's an overwhelming public perception that there isn't a shift, that professional dance hasn't shifted for the public, and from a position of being viewed by those who devolve money to give money to organisations such as Dance4 and artists, there's still a perception that the form hasn't shifted, and in some way areas or territory of dance and choreography that we're interested in is somehow still seeking validity because an audience isn't present for it. And so an area of interest for me about this particular area of work is that somehow, is it revealing a discourse between an audience, the public, and artists about that shift?
And do you think there is an audience for work of this nature, Paul? Or do you think that audience is starting to emerge? I think it's
It's really hard, because I think so often the work explores many more contexts than professional dance is perceived to exist in. So this practice actually, it uses much more of the public realm, much more maybe of the visual art context, or particularly in my experience. And I think maybe the public's view is that dance exists on stage.
Yeah.
And so...
Whereas probably many of the projects that you have created are about dance happening in other settings and other contexts. The Dance at Home is a good example. I mean, where are the kind of settings and contexts where you've created and shared work, Joe?
Nottingham Contemporary as well, the piece that I've been talking about. But that feels really helpful for me, that part of this conversation, because I agree. I was kind of struggling to think about the kind of difference of those two groups of performers, let's say, that I worked with, and there doesn't feel to me like there is a great difference, and that's really helped me, I think. I think there has been a huge shift in dance. We've certainly seen it. There are many big pockets where there hasn't been such shifts. I think that's really the case. Yeah.
For somebody like you, Greg, has the process shifted your perception of who is a dancer? Where does dance happen?
Well, I mean, I was already aware because of Jennifer's involvement with dance. I've been to see dance performances in art galleries and open spaces, and so I already had a view that this could happen anywhere. But I think what somebody said is right. Some people view dance as something you come and sit in seats like this, you look at the stage and you expect to be entertained. You don't expect to be challenged. And I think in open spaces a lot of people back away from dance because they're afraid they might have to get involved. I think the general public have just got a fear and they don't understand contemporary dance. I go to see contemporary dance and I see the same people time and time and time again. There's no... Sorry,
it would be the same if you went to football. You'd see the same football spectators time and time and time again. Everything's a niche.
Yes, but
football has a slightly bigger niche, though. It could be argued.
Even if I go to Notts County, I'd see the same 15,000 people again. I wouldn't see the same 25. And
it's true.
I mean, I'm not saying there's... I don't know what's happening with Dance4 in terms of reaching out to different parts of the community. But I think unless people are interested in dance already, they're scared to engage.
I mean, that brings us to another question, doesn't it? About actually, do people get involved in projects like this because they've already been activated by friends or family or whatever, and are we actually just working with the usual suspects, either disadvantaged groups or community groups, or in the case of the Dance Commission Collective, the privileged few who have the resources financially to commission a piece. So how does what is essentially a kind of potentially fairly marginal practice in some ways, how does that start to become more mainstream and get more people involved?
I was thinking about this idea of the invitation and thought that's actually really interesting, because obviously Dad's here because I had a sort of understanding of what the aesthetic of the work might be and what he might be expected to do. So I could have that conversation with my dad and be like, well, it's probably going to be fairly I made assumptions.
Yeah.
It was probably going to be fairly gestural, and I knew the artists he was working with would be very sensitive to all of the participants, and that there probably would be some kind of score. They wouldn't just say, move your body around. So I was able to have that conversation with Dad. So he trusted me. He trusted Dance4 from other experiences, I suppose. And then for working with Dance4 for a short period of time, during Not Dance, and then talking about Lady Down, it was interesting with who we approached to.
But we we had that conversation, didn't we? Because I remember saying to Jen, would your dad, it would be more scary. So it comes back to that risk point. That actually, I remember thinking Greg was in a group of 25 people in the confines of the space at Contemporary. It was very different to saying, would you come and join 12 people and lay down in the train station and Snettle Market?
And the risk is kind of really enhanced and intensified, because it's not like you're writing a piece where you put the paper or the publication out into the world. You're putting your body with all its stresses, strains, limitations into the world.
You have as well, for someone like Greg to be laid in the train station on his own, that vulnerability that as an organisation and as a choreographer in Florence you place on that person.
But then I think there are a lot of the people that would really enjoy an experience like this, but just reading it on a piece of paper and not knowing, but that's too much of a massive risk for so many people.
I think it's sort of what you were saying about the risk. It's actually a measure of what Florence did and what she put into us, that by the time it came to getting into the train station, I was first in and first down on a piece of cardboard, because that's how confident I felt, that's how involved I felt in the piece by the time we came to the performance.
I think there's also something about yesterday in a different conversation, but about environment and context. There was a reflection about, of course, in the concept of making and presenting and sharing the work, those who have an intimate knowledge of that, who are participating in it, have a particular view. But there are those things that then potentially leak out because of the people who then come into contact with it as a piece of work in a public space, for instance.
Yeah.
So actually knowing Lay Me Down was in the station, just observing then and hearing conversations that then took place in that environment following certain actions that took place in that work. Hopefully,
do we start to get a different location of quality inside people who take part in a project like this? Where does the locus of evaluation sit?
The first thing I can think of is music. Now people kind of perceive music. If somebody listens to a band and they don't like the band, they don't kind of automatically say, oh, I don't like this music.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or film.
Exactly.
Sarah?
I was going to say, it seems to be really sort of abstract now even further. It seems that there's a universal thing here about, you're talking about developing relationships actually in everything that you do and in your engagement with the public. You're talking about developing relationships, and somehow maybe that's what you look at the quality of, is the quality of the relationships that you're building.
Yeah.
And with that, I'm going to go back to Paul's talking audience invitation.
Yeah.
And your envision as the curator or everything is okay, that you don't like it. So we start to see our taste, or an audience, individual people might feel okay about seeing their taste as distinct, as something distinct. So Joe, you were talking about an education context with early choreographers, and in developing conversations with audience. I don't know that this easily comes into it. The discussions that step not away from not liking something, but that it's okay that I don't like it, and more about that. So the whole discussion around dance can encompass, Greg, what you said, challenging. You don't go to see dance or you don't expect to be challenged when you go to see dance. Well, maybe that. I don't know how you bring that into conversation with the general public.
But part of it is too is that, I mean, it's partly about conversation and discourse, but Jane, you also said that actually you don't really like to talk about it. You actually, for you discover it by making.
To talk about it, and in working with people, how you frame an invitation or an instruction, or how you use words to support a process is actually really important. I kind of get stuck with theories, possibly because actually in the making there are all sorts of things that are difficult to understand and difficult to pin down. You can draw out a methodology, and there is one, which is why there is an attention to quality, because it's not random, it's not without care. But for things to kind of grow in a way which might be unexpected or might make new connections between ideas and relations, then that has to be about not just going, oh well, this follows this and this follows this. And that's the bit that is difficult to put into words. That's the bit about working where you take the words away, and that's why we bring it back to the body, and we bring it back to actually how do I feel if we just watch you for a bit. And I know it's but about raising and the awareness of seeing, about I don't know, the doing, and bring it back to making. And some of that is mysterious, I think, and which, yeah.
And messy. I mean, messy is a great word, isn't it? Because our relationships with people are messy, and the quality of our relationships with people, is, you can say I have a great relationship with that person, but your relationship with them can often still be very, very messy. And in a way, the process of care is working with the messiness of relationships and people in relation to each other, and actually creating some kind of order and meaning out of it through the dance. Sorry, Jim.
I'd also flip that about those participants and relation to the work as well. So the projects similar to the ones that you talked about, managed and looked after participants who said, I want to be part of that. And the thing about invitation and the thing about involving people is they all come with a different set of needs. And I feel that if you really look to what their need is from participating, taking part, being with another body in that moment, in that process, then I think we might alleviate their kind of exploitation a little bit. Maybe that's reframed. And I think it would make better invitation and maybe better participation. So, I feel that's a really important thing.
That links back to that concept of actually the quality of the process being less in the output potentially and more in the care taken of the participants throughout the process. That notion of curare, the curator.
I would just say that's equally true for, in this binarism, so-called professional work. Some choreographers worked more with that intention of knowing the individual rather than the kind of hired body.
I think they say that from a place where those binaries are not exist.
Yeah.
Well, they're obviously thick. Clearly.
Yeah.
I think one of the things about Dance4 as an organisation, I think, is that it, and this is the kind of closing remark that you're looking for, Stuart, is, I think, while we all segue into the film, but I think there is something about Dance4 as an organisation that it puts a lot of time and energy into caring for its artists, its choreographers, its participants, its communication. It doesn't always, like all organisations, we don't always get things right, but having the honesty and the kind of sense of personal ethics as an organisation to understand when you're really caring for people and when that slips, I think is really important as well. So I just think that, Dance4 take a lot of care in that kind of process too, which is why Greg survived the process.
But you can come back for more.
Come back for more.
Risk has been mentioned as well, and that really resonates to me as a thing that enables art forms and artists and practices and everything to move forward. And I think that care of audiences and care of participants, whether they are professional or unprofessional, where they sit. And if you care for those people, then you can let them take a risk, and they'll go with you because there's a level of care, a duty of
I love that idea, and there's a teacher who I work with, Helen Poyner, or who I used to work with. She's a movement artist. She works a lot in the environment, and she's often doing projects which are a health and safety nightmare. And often she has to say, actually this has to be off insurance, and you're doing this at your own risk. But an expression that she uses that I love is the dignity of risk.
Oh, that's beautiful, isn't it?
Actually, if we take that away from someone, it's not a facilitative
Disempowering
process.
to manage their own risk and their own safety.
There's great dignity in our own risk. I think that resonates in so many ways.
So let's take that out into the coffee bar, Stuart. But that's lovely. So let's carry that phrase, the dignity of risk, and the beauty of risk, what can come from taking a risk. Isn't that right, Greg? Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Gillie said something at the very beginning about, that the discourse around this work tends not to be quite very sophisticated. But I'd like to thank the panel and yourselves for helping us make, I think, what was quite a sophisticated conversation. So thank you. We are going to take a 10-minute coffee break.